Heterotopia runs as a red thread in the feminist theory of refusal. It starts with the Cicerone in chapter 1, then goes on to Cavarero's inclination in chapter 2, and finally reaches Muhammad Ali's education in the power of heterotopia. Bonnie clarifies her take of the notion by citing Foucault, but also Cavarero. Having written about heterotopias for a very long time, I was drawn to this notion and its various entanglements in the feminist theory of refusal. There are therefore two suggestions that I want to make. First, I would invite us to think about heterotopias not as spatio-temporal entities, as is often the case in the literature, but as practices and relations entangled in the feminist theory of refusal. The idea here is to turn the noun heterotopia to an adjective, heterotopic or heterotopian, as Bonnie does in chapter 3, referring to heterotopian inclination and heterotopian settings. In this sense, instead of asking whether we can imagine the Cicerone as a heterotopia, we should rather think of heterotopic practices in what I would call the Cicerone assemblage. These heterotopic practices then make relations of exteriority with the city assemblage. On page 22, Bonnie writes, once on Cicerone, women establish a heterotopia where they can practice another way of living. My intervention here would be that heterotopias can never be established or stabilized because that would defeat the function around which they revolve, and this is othering. We could, however, take the backhand's practices of sleeping during the day or the breastfeeding of non-humans as heterotopic, othering who they are as women. These heterotopic practices and indeed relations are later plugged into different assemblages, the city that these othered women re-enter and ultimately leave in chapter 2. As Bonnie writes in chapter 3, rather than give up Cicerone, Agave seeks to bring it to Thebes. My second suggestion is to read the feminist theory of refusal as an assemblage of heterotopic writings and later reading practices, not only between the three components in the arc of refusal, namely inoperativity, inclination, and fabulation, but also in the context of the wide range of textual and visual components and story worlds that Bonnie brings in the horizon of her refusal theory. Having followed her work over the years, this is the feeling, the sapore, Cavarero would say, of Bonnie's writings. I enter the discourse of a book or an article, and swiftly I feel I am moved into other planes, both philosophical and literary, but also sensual. Bonnie's writings in general, and this book in particular, open up other spaces and other times. Indeed, Bonnie others the way we think, problematize, imagine. This is her function as an author, Foucault would say. To give you an example from this book, I didn't know about the feats. And when I found it on YouTube and started watching it, I really felt I was transferred in other spaces and other times, heterotemporalities as I have called them. I can say with confidence that this was not just a subjective experience, although there is no doubt that reading Bonnie as a heterotopia is my own fabulation. There have been real facts that have grounded my sapore. These were my students. At the time I was reading the book, I was also preparing my gender studies lecture on embodiment. And to help my undergraduate students understand the notion of the existential experience of embodiment, I showed them the clip of the last scenes in the feeds, while reading some extracts from Bonnie's commentary and analysis. It had such an impression on them to the point that it made its way in some of the essays that I have just finished marking. This does not happen very often in undergraduate assessments. Last night, I finished Sandia Hartman's Wayward Lives, which was another shell-shocking experience. Taking my inspiration from Bonnie's multimedia assemblages, I was listening to Ethel Waters' Billie Holidays and Trixie Smith's Blues, or watching Gladys Bentley's YouTube clips while reading the book, amongst other heterotopic reading practices. So, Bonnie, thank you for these heterotopic offerings.